Hey, what's going on, guys? So this is going to be the last review in the series of three flat-sided crankbaits that I'm reviewing this week. This is going to be the Spro John Cruz Little John flat-sided shallow diving crankbait. The John Cruz line of crankbaits, they have, I think there's like four of them. You have like the deep diving one, the medium diving one, and then the shallow diving one. This is obviously the shallow diving one. They call it the Little John. They also have the Fat John, which is their square bill crankbait, if you will. And I'll make some comparisons between this bait and that bait. So as far as this bait is concerned, it obviously comes in the one size. As far as the Little John crankbait is concerned, this is the 2.5 inches in length. And it has a weight of a half an ounce, which I think is a little ambitious. It's probably closer to like, I don't know, maybe 7/16 or 3/8 of an ounce. Has a diving depth of 3 to 5 feet, and it's obviously a floating lure. Now, in my experience with this bait between the Jackall Bling and the KJ Flat, go ahead and throw these up there so we have some references here. In these three crankbaits that we have here, as far as comparisons, I found that the Little John seemed to dive the deepest. Not surprising when you look at it versus the KJ Flat, considering the diving angle of that bill. This one has a steeper diving angle, which is going to influence its depth a little bit more, where this one's going to want to probably just kind of plow through the water a little bit more than this one's going to kind of want to cut through the water and go downward. So not surprisingly that this one dives deeper than that one. As far as the Bling is concerned, the Bling is seemingly the smallest crankbait, probably apparently the smallest crankbait as well. When you look at them, the Bling seems to be the lightest of the three, and the Spro Little John seems to be just slightly bigger than this one. Not as big as the KJ Flat, but the KJ Flat has that bigger, or that more steeper pitch to that diving bill. So it's really between these two, and this one is a little bit bigger, and it just seems to want to dive down a little bit deeper. So just for your guys' reference, so it seems to want to dive. It's probably closer to that 5-foot depth, where the KJ Flat's probably closer to that 3-foot depth, and the Jackall Bling is probably closer to the 4-foot depth. So just so you guys have points of reference there. So again, it's a flat-sided crankbait, you guys. Now I'm going to show you guys and you guys can reference my review that I did last year. I think it was a year, maybe 2 years ago, on the Spro Fat John. It's really interesting when you look at these two crankbaits, because when you look at them on the internet, most of the views that you guys see on these crankbaits are these profile views, which is great, and you guys can see the bill angles on them and stuff, and you can see that they're both fiberglass bills, so they have that thin circuit board lip, as they call them. But a lot of guys look at these baits and they're like, man, those are the same baits. I just don't see the biggest differences. Now, obviously, this bait is obviously smaller than this bait. The Fat John is like a 5/8 ounce crankbait. This one, like I said, they say it's half ounce, but I say it's closer to 7/16 or even 3/8 of an ounce. Where you guys are going to see it is on the top view. This is a skinnier crankbait. Now, they're both flat-sided crankbaits, which is interesting because this is more their square bill, wide wobbling crankbait. But when we turn them on their side, you're going to see that Fat John is obviously a fat crankbait. The bills are kind of similar. The Fat John obviously has a wider bill, being it's a wider bait, and this one has a skinnier bill because it's a skinnier bait. But they're very, very similar, but they don't behave the same in the water at all. This one has a wider wobble, has better deflection characteristics to it. Being you look at that bill, it's kind of a steeper bill. It's going to help plow through the water and keep the hooks behind the bill. Where this one's going to kind of dive down and straight into it and kind of leave the hooks exposed because the bill is not going to deflect away from it. So the point is that they don't behave the same. So don't make the mistake of buying one bait over the other, because the Little John doesn't behave the same as the Fat John. The Little John is still going to be more of the finesse style. I used the reference in the last review from the KJ Flat as being a finesse power fishing, where you're using a reaction bait and kind of fishing it possibly quicker, but at the same time it's still skinnier and has a really slow float to it because it's not as buoyant as the Fat John. They just don't behave the same, and they have it has a more of a they both have a swimming action. The Fat John kind of has a wide swinging arc to it, where the Little John has a kind of a small swinging arc to it. Kind of goes to the water very, very subtly. Acts kind of like it. Some people say it acts like a lipless crankbait. It doesn't rock or vibrate in the water like a lipless crankbait, but I guess it has a characteristic of it's very subtle in the water. If you were looking at it, it's moving so quickly this way from side to side that it almost looks like it's sitting still going through the water. So, and that's kind of what the fish are going to see as well. The biggest thing that you recognize about this lure, seeing that it is a transparent bait, you'll see that it has that tungsten weight that transfers to the back when you cast it. It's not a rattle, guys. It's not a rattle. So you hear it this way. In fact, the bait or the weight inside there almost feels like it has a rubber coating on it, because you can't even hear it slam from front to back at all. I mean, it almost feels like it's cushioning its fall when it's moving from front to back. It doesn't sound the same as the other one. While we're here, you can see it has an oval split ring. It seems like all the Spro baits come with Gamakatsu hooks. It doesn't look like a short shank Gamakatsu hook either. It looks like it's the standard kind of just long shank, if you will. But the point is that they put a weight transfer ball in there, and I was really excited to use this bait because of that weight transfer ball, because it is a small crankbait that doesn't get a lot of casting distance. As far as these flat-sided small crankbaits don't get very good casting distance, so I thought that this one was going to outperform the other ones far and away as far as casting distance was concerned. I found conversely was actually true. I found it to be it didn't cast exceptionally better than the other ones. It might have casted moderately better, but it wasn't anything that would make me want to buy this crankbait over the other two crankbaits for casting distance by itself. If you think you're going to get huge casting increases from this lure over the other two, I think you're going to be a little bit disappointed, because that's just not the way that the casting chamber or that weight transfer ball is going to affect this bait. It's just not going to affect it that tremendously. So, but again, just like the other baits, it has that small swimming arc to it. You're going to use it in more finesse style situations if they're keying on shad in shallow water, possibly cold water, late fall, early spring style bait. That's probably where this bait is going to be really at home, because it's not a squirrel bill crankbait, you guys. They don't behave like squirrel bill crankbaits, so don't make the mistake of thinking that you're going to be able to use it in the same situations as a squirrel bill crankbait, because I think you're going to be disappointed. Not to say that you wouldn't catch fish where you would use it in a squirrel bill crankbait situation, but the point is that it's not a squirrel bill crankbait and it doesn't behave the same. So I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on that with this category of finesse, shallow diving, flat-sided crankbaits, because they're not the same. So go and show you guys a measurement here of the Spro Little John from the rear ring, the hook hanger, to the front hook hanger. It's about 2 3/8 inches. The body of the crankbait is actually about 2 1/8 inches, and then with the bill, we're pushing all the way up to 2 13/16. So it's a pretty small little crankbait compared to the what are they, the squirrel bill crankbait counterparts. But I don't know if I mentioned this, it does have a slow float to it, just like the other ones do. Kind of just ties into the whole really slow finesse style nature of these flat-sided crankbaits. So go ahead and show you guys the color. In fact, right here, it's the first one. It's called Blood Crawl, right here on Tackle Warehouse. Transparent bait, so you can see all the way through it, but it's kind of like a crawdad imitation, kind of like a darker color. Obviously not as bright as something like the T.O. Craw from Lucky Craft. It's a little bit more muted and darker than that. Probably use it on darker days, on places where you're going to have a lot of crawdads and stuff like that. But kind of like a smoke. I don't want to say black, but it's kind of like a smoked top on the top of the bait there. You can see it says Spro Little John there on the bottom. So there is Blood Craw. the next one here is called Spooky Shad. Spooky Shad is just a ghost minnow. You can see it's got the scale pattern there on the back, and the ear, or the shad dot, if you will, there behind the gill plates, kind of like a brown head there, and just an overall kind of misted white or pearl body to it, a little more pronounced there on the belly. So there is Spooky Shad. All right, guys, so there's my review of the 3 crankbaits. We have the Jackall Bling, the KJ Flat, the Spro Little John. All great little crankbaits. Make sure you guys use them for their intended purpose, as far as don't make the mistake of thinking that you're going to go out and power fish these crankbaits in the heaviest to cover, and thinking that you're going to come through unscathed, because the crankbait is not a square bill crankbait. It doesn't have the same characteristics, but if you use it for its intended purpose and you guys understand what these baits were designed to do, I think you're going to really like them. They're probably not going to see a ton of action from me on the water, because I'm still going to use the square bill crankbaits a lot, but I think that when you have a shad bite in colder water with finicky fish, and maybe possibly using these as a search bait or something like that, I think you're going to find some success with these baits. So check them out if you guys get the opportunity. If you guys like the video, please hit the like button down there in the lower left corner. Really appreciate that. Stay tuned for our next reviews. I think we're going to do the remaining lipless crankbaits that I have, and then I have a couple of rip baits to do, and then I'm going to place the tackle warehouse order here in the next week or two, I think. So stay tuned, guys. Thanks a lot.